Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be venturing in the middle of nowhere. But don't worry, we are not alone. For we are being graciously joined by fellow content creator, The Crime Reel. Over on his channel, you can find content about true crime and cases that might have been forgotten to time. It's very interesting. So interesting, in fact, that I have narrated a case over on his channel. It is a really good, interesting, and dark cold case. One that left me with chills. When you're done here, I highly recommend checking it out. The link to the case can be found in the description or at the end of the video. Either way, I hope you do go see it. He's a very talented up-and-coming creator, and you're gonna want to be subscribed to him. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a 45-mile, 3-night kayaking trip down the Green River in Kentucky, which runs above the Mammoth Cave System, the world's longest known cave system, with more than 400 miles of surveyed passageways. We brought everything we needed in our kayaks and one canoe: food, tents, water filtration, etc., and camped each night on the riverbank when it started getting dark and we found level enough ground. The first night was uneventful, except to say that there is nothing like a wall of fireflies against a mountainous black tree line at night in the middle of nowhere. The second day, around sunset, after a long day of kayaking and baking in the July heat, we came upon a stream in the bank that opened up into a large ravine. The streams, as we found out, was a cave spring pouring out blue, freezing cold water into a lagoon, about 30 feet wide, and so deep the blue water turned black after a few feet. The lagoon had a long sandy beach, secluded by hills on either side and a tall overhanging cliff behind and above us. It was a beautiful, otherworldly place. Time moved very slowly there. We decided to camp there for the night. The sand was soft, white, and very fine, ideal for ground sleeping. For some reason, the place deeply frightened me, but I didn't speak up. We were all tired, and everyone was having fun. We built a small fire and enjoyed the stars through the canopy of leaves for a while before everyone went to bed. I slept hard that night. At around 5 AM I woke up with a huge urge to relieve myself. It was still dark. I had the tent door zipper about halfway open, and I had just popped my head out when I heard a loud and terrible roar/scream. I immediately cowered back into the tent and zipped it closed, and I waited. The scream came from about 10 feet to the left, near the dwindling fire. It was high-pitched, but not like an owl's screech, though I'm not ruling that out. It was a wretched, pained scream that got lower-pitched at the end. Being that we were in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, most likely it was a fox or boar or some kind of bird. Whatever it was, I lay awake for an hour, listening. I heard absolutely nothing. Granted, we were on a soft beach, but I didn't hear a single twig snap or leaf crinkle when whatever it was finally shuffled away. It was bizarre. I should mention at this time that up the beach and off to the side of the lagoon was a small dry cave opening maybe 3 feet wide. I cannot say with any certainty that it was not some ancient cave-dwelling creature that surfaced to investigate our camp. I somehow fell back asleep and awoke the next morning shaken. I asked if any of my friends heard the terrible scream, but no one had, and we pressed on down the Green River. The third night at dusk, we came upon a large, rocky beach. We pulled our boats ashore and decided this would have to do, as we didn't want to go further down the river and risk being stuck on the water at dark. This rocky beach was where the river split in two, and in the middle formed a collection of pale rocks, tall grass and dried out wood. A desolate pile of muck the size of a football field. A landmass was covered in jumping sand spiders and tiny frogs. Again, otherworldly. We set up camp, ate, and all went to bed around the same time. It was silent for 20 to 30 minutes. I'm not sure. I was asleep, as the others were most likely as well. Suddenly my dream was interrupted by what sounded like a booming loud mechanical wooden beast. I awoke and shot straight up. It was truly the loudest thing I've ever heard. It sounded like a massive bulldozer tearing down a huge steel and wooden building. And then came a boom, followed by its echo throughout the river valley. The animals shifted, and the birds flew away. We were all awoken by the crash and yelling in confusion at each other in our tents. Nothing but silence followed outside our tents, and no one was particularly willing to shine a flashlight towards the woods. Eventually, we all decided it was just a falling tree, and went back to sleep. The next morning I thought about it a bit more. It didn't sound like just a tree falling. I must stress it had a metallic quality, and it was projected purposefully. It almost sounded like a roar. In the morning light, we found no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, nor any obviously fallen trees that could have made such a loud sound. So we packed up and headed out onto the river one last time to head home. My friends and I talk about that trip and all the weird things that happened. We did the same kayak trip a few years later, and nothing out of the ordinary occurred. No mysterious forest noises, to both my disappointment and relief.
I worked for a professor that asked me to house sit for him while he was out of town to see the bowl game that we were in. He was gone for 3 days and had a huge piece of land in the middle of nowhere. He had horses and fishing and a gator to ride around on. So the first 2 nights went down with no incident, but the last night, his little foofy dog is having a fit. She keeps barking at the back door. At first, we blow it off, but decide to lock the dog inside in case of a coyote or something. After a while, we start to get a little creeped out. I keep saying it's probably an animal and would be fine. My girlfriend wants to go investigate to see what's outside. So I lock the door behind her. Actually, I was just kidding. She goes outside and says she saw something small and grey. It's probably a coyote. And it ran off. So just an animal, no worries. But by this time, we're pretty spooked. The dog now starts barking at the window on the other side of the house. We're still trying to ignore it, but a little worried. We decide to get into bed. There's an awkward silence. Then I hear it. It sounds like a young girl singing a soft, eerie lullaby. I don't say anything, hoping that my mind is playing tricks on me. My girlfriend says, "Let's get the hell out of here." I say, "Why?" She says, "You didn't hear that little girl singing?" Okay, let's get the hell out. And we got out. I even called someone to talk to me while we walked out to my car. Next morning, I went up to clean the house and such. It was truly the most scared I've ever been. Ever.
I've always worked for security companies. You name it, I've done it. Private venues, events, buildings, and now lately, dilapidated structures. I was in charge of looking after this building at night. I don't even know why they needed security. It was grotty, it was dingy, and it reeked in certain parts. Without a doubt, animals had got in and never found their way out, and the stench of their corpses rotting around the building were incredibly off-putting in the summer heat. Let me give you a bit of background. This building that I worked in was in the most remote part I had ever worked. Most of the time, I had to work in the city, but the guys I worked for told me about this opportunity. It was far out and about an hour's drive, but the pay was lucrative and well worth the effort. I would be working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The job? Ensuring no one broke into this busted down building. I tried asking for details about why they'd want to keep this place after going there a few times, but my employers could not or did not know the reasons. This place, as I said before, was nothing special. In fact, it was an eyesore in the middle of the forest. I don't know what it was before. It had been well gutted, and any traces of what it could have previously been had obviously been removed. To me, it was just the decaying shell of a building. I still am itching to know what was there before. It spurs my interest, and when I was doing my rounds, I'd look about to see if I could find bits of paper, documentation, or anything like that. Usually, when companies close down buildings, they don't even bother removing the contents. They just close it, and whatever's left inside is left there. I've been in buildings plenty of times, with loads of files and information, sometimes even electronics, that they've just blatantly left to rot forever. But, in this case, there was nothing. I was doing my rounds as usual, having only worked there for 2 weeks. This was easily one of the easiest jobs I had ever done. All I had to do was patrol twice a night. It's not like anyone was here to check up on me anyway. But I did my patrols, made sure everything was good, and would just scroll through my phone, reading, listening, doing all kinds of stuff. The night was my own, and this hardly felt like work. However, through the sea of cameras that I had in front of me, checking on all the decay, did something flash on the top rightmost monitor. There was movement. The movement was definitely human. This person moved, almost glided across the screen. I saw this person, and in a blink they were gone. I'd only caught them a little too late, as I had been browsing Reddit. I checked the section and knew exactly where they were, not 3 minutes away from my station. So I grabbed my flashlight and quietly made my way round, seeing if I could hear anything. When I reached the area, I patrolled as quietly as I could and found nothing. After not finding anyone or hearing anything, I resorted to shouting, telling them that they were on private property and that if they didn't reveal themselves now, I'd call the cops. Empty threats, but sometimes you have to employ these. There was nothing. I searched for a good 20 minutes in vain, and this site was absolutely huge, so there's no way I was going to invest more time, and retreated back to my little hideout, monitoring the cameras more carefully this time, but for the entirety of the night, I didn't see a single thing. Weeks passed without incident, and the previous event had now, in the back of my mind, been labelled as a blimp, something that I had obviously misseen while browsing my phone, and left it at that. It was around this time that after I was relieving Robbie from the day shift, did I strike up a conversation with him. We usually chit-chatted a little bit, but I had arrived a little bit earlier than anticipated, with there being far less traffic on the road, and we started talking. He was just getting ready to leave, when out of nowhere he looked at me and said, "Have you ever seen something in the camera?" I didn't reply and gave him a quizzical look. He continued, "I've seen some things, man. In the morning sometimes. I don't know." He looked down at his feet, started rubbing them against the floor, grabbed his bag, and without another word was gone. Was he just telling me this place was haunted or something? I tried laughing it off, knowing full well in the back of my mind that I had seen something, but chose to keep that to myself. I didn't want him to think me mad. A few weeks down the line, and nothing eventful had happened. All that I knew is that I had this job, and it was super easy. But it was on this night that everything changed. I was doing my rounds, and as I was walking down a decaying hallway, did I hear something? It sounded like laughter. The laughter of children. At least 2 or 3. Now, I've had my run-in with urban explorers in other places, but never here. But who the hell would bring their children in the middle of the night to a decaying building? That is beyond me. I ran and screamed for them to stop, running in the direction I swore I heard them in. When I reached it, it was just an empty room. I listened, and I heard them again. This time, they were in the direction that I had just come from. Now, to describe this place, I was in a corridor. There was only one way to get to the room I went to, and unless they passed me in the darkness and were completely immune to my flashlight illuminating them, there was no way I could have missed them. Upon running that way, I made extra careful to ensure I looked everywhere, and told them to stop. When I reached the room, nothing. Again. I was becoming very scared at this point. Twice I had heard children laughing and the sound of young feet hitting the ground. I'm not gonna lie, I just about wanted to pack up my stuff and go home, so I quietly began making my way to the stairs. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, just footsteps, coming from above me. They were running down at speed. Fight or flight kicked in. Was I gonna confront this intruder? Hell no. I grabbed my flashlight tightly in my hand and bolted it down the stairs, jumping 2, sometimes 3 a go, trying to make my way to the bottom as quickly as I could. I ran out, hit the ground floor, flew out the fire exit, and didn't look back. I heard the door slam shut as I made my exit, and not 3 seconds later did I hear it slam open. It was with such force that it hit the back wall with a loud smack. I didn't stop running. I made it to my car, switched the engine on, and was about to peel out of there when I looked around. There was nothing. I made sure my car was locked up and waited in silence just to check. Had I imagined it? Surely not. But I sat there, sweat dripping down my back and neck, in utter terror. I think it took me an hour before I felt safe enough to leave my vehicle. Thoughts plaguing my mind of the intruder hiding behind my car outside my field of vision, waiting to jump me the moment I exit the safety of my vehicle. When I did leave, I looked around. There was nothing. I went to check the door, which had slammed with such force I was sure it had broken off its hinges. But when I went to check, it was closed. There didn't even appear to be a dent in the wall as I had suspected. Maybe it wasn't as hard as I thought. I went back to my security station and reviewed the footage. I looked, and it was just me running away from nothing. The cameras didn't pick up anything. Just a crazy security guard running from thin air down the stairs and through the grass to the car. I sat there shocked. Was I tired? Hallucinating? I didn't know. All that I knew was that I was done with this place. In the morning, when my relief came, I looked at him straight in the eye and said, "You're right. There is something about this place, and I'm not coming back to find out. Good luck." I told my company that I didn't want to be stationed there anymore, and within a few days I was stationed at a nice, unhaunted building in the middle of the city, with great Wi-Fi. That's where I stayed for a few more years, but the thought in the back of my mind always did remain. Was that place seriously haunted? Or was it all in my mind? Maybe I'll never know, and maybe that's for the better.
One time we were riding ATVs around on the mountains near our hunting cabin. It was getting dark, so we were heading home on an old logging trail miles deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness. All of a sudden, we saw headlights coming in on an adjoining trail that were much too big for ATVs. We quickly turned off our headlights. We pulled off the trail deep enough into the woods where we knew we wouldn't be seen, and we killed the engines. We knew the guy who owned the property, and he gave us permission to ride there. But not any others, as far as we knew, so coming across someone else seemed unlikely. We hadn't before. The path the truck took led to a gate. One guy got out, and thanks to the truck's interior lights, we could see 3 other men with firearms. The one who got out checked the gate, but had no luck getting through. He went back to the truck, grabbed a pair of bolt cutters and cut the lock so they could pass through. From there, we waited until the truck was out of sight and bolted down the mountain as fast as we could. When we got back to our cabin, we called the owner, and he said no one should have been up there, so he'd check it out. The whole situation was sketchy at best. Our guess is that they were poachers, as we knew the area quite well and had never seen any suspicious landmarks that would denote illegal activity, such as pot fields. It still creeps me out thinking about what would have happened had we been seen.
Just over 10 years ago, I was fresh out of college and had moved back to my parents' house for the free rent and food for 9 months or so before I was leaving the state for graduate school. Now my parents are super chill and gave me my own space in the house, but being a 22-year-old single guy and living at a house in the sticks, as they had recently moved about 40 miles south of a major Midwest city, is certainly not ideal. But I didn't have any other options, so I started looking for some work to pass the time more than to save up money. Anyway, so summer turned into winter and I still hadn't found anything solid. But by then, I desperately needed to spend more time out of my parents' house, so I took a part-time gig doing some light bookkeeping for a small business owner my dad knew. I didn't really want to do it since it didn't pay much, but it was short-term and wasn't even a real office setup. But again, my parents lived in the middle of nowhere Midwest. Think acres and acres of farms. And I knew I had limited local opportunities to make some cash. And this guy was going to pay me under the table as well. About that time, a friend of mine in the city said that if I had just paid him $200 a month and helped clean up, he'd have let me crash in his living room until I was ready to move out of state. That was all I needed to hear. I took the job. So my dad's friend's family had a construction-type business. They helped out with building stuff, but it was more ultimately focused on renting out a few bobcats and larger augers they owned, and other various drills, and then odds and ends like generators and other low-level construction or farming equipment that someone in the area couldn't afford to purchase but needed to use from time to time. This was a small mum-and-pop style thing, where everyone knew everyone, and the office only opened on days when someone was coming by, and was just generally a mutually beneficial situation for the business owners and the locals. Since I had minored in a business-adjacent area, and my dad recommended me, they trusted me to go in there for about 15 to 20 hours a week and check and file the rental forms, make sure nobody missed payment days, and if there were payment plans in place, answer an email or two, and talk discussing prices and availability. Super easy gig. The old building where I worked was 90 years old, and on top of this little hill, and the downstairs used to be an old country bar until the 70s, when this family bought it cheap, cleared out the bar and fenced in the property to use it as a parking lot to store all their rental equipment and gear. I could generally come and go as I please. I worked any hours I wanted to, as long as the work was done. So if things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a few days, I'd usually go in after 7 and stay until around midnight or 1, since I knew I'd be alone and could listen to music out loud and take my time. The office where I worked was on the second floor of the building above the old bar, and looked out onto the long driveway. From my seat, I could easily see out the window, and once or twice saw a family of deer or a raccoon scamper by, and I always glanced out when I saw movement, since it was very noticeable. It was incredibly remote, very still and quiet, so if something unusual occurred, or if something felt off, I definitely noticed it. One night during winter, it had snowed a few inches, and my dad told me to stay in because the roads were bad. But I had an old SUV, and more than that, just really wanted to get out of the house. So I went into work at about 8 PM and was going to stay until just after 1. I always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill, since, believe me when I say, nobody ever showed up at night, since we were literally in the middle of nowhere. I think the nearest occupied house was about 2 miles down the road, and to even turn onto our short road, you had to only be coming to our specific building and probably knew where it was beforehand. It was a locals only type thing, and very small, since the family had inherited a lot of money, and kind of did this rental thing on the side. Basically, someone would never just get lost and end up at our building. So I'm jamming away to some Fall Out Boy. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young, and having some coffee and kept glancing at the snow outside here and there, since our one orangish street light was reflecting onto the ground at the gate and was causing the light to shine off the snow in a really cool and pretty way. At one point around midnight, I went downstairs to the big bathroom to do my bathroom business, and then came back upstairs and got settled into work. I probably did about 5 minutes worth of work when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint of something in the fresh snow just below the light. It seemed like it must have been a huge dog or substantial animal had rolled around on the ground there. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had to have happened when I was in the bathroom, or perhaps when my back was turned, since I would have seen that type of movement for sure. I shook it off and assumed a dog, or maybe even a farm animal, as it was common in this type of area. I assumed it gotten loose and maybe was attracted to the light. Who knows? At around 2 in the morning, I was getting ready to leave, and as always, got out of my car to lock the gate up, and I'll be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow. But when I looked down, I was shocked to see that it wasn't just some disturbed snow, but the undeniable imprint of a human-made snow angel. If you don't know what a snow angel is, it's when kids lie on their backs in the snow, push their arms and legs back forth, so when they get up, it looks like the outline of an angel. I used to do this when I was a kid, so I 100% knew for sure that's what it was, and it was deliberately made underneath the light post. But it wasn't from a kid. It was from a very large person, or at the very least a normal-sized adult, wearing tons of layers of big winter clothing. I looked up and saw what I already knew, that whoever had made this snow angel could have easily looked up and seen me through the window, so they must have waited for me to head downstairs to make it. Now I definitely would have seen or heard someone drive up to our building, even if I was in the bathroom, so I knew someone had to have walked up in the freezing cold snow for miles, stopped in front of our building, did a snow angel in the small amount of time I wasn't sitting in front of my desk, and I glanced around for tracks in the snow, and saw that there was one set that led to the nearby woods right out of the building. So it was clear the person didn't use the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which made me instantly uneasy, since that side was just trees and darkness for miles. I was definitely a little freaked out now, once I realized that someone had just been this close to me secretly in the middle of the woods, and I looked around but didn't see anything amiss at all, and now I just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I got back in my car and drove a few feet, I realized my boss would be there in about 4 hours, and might see the snow angel and assume I did it, since he probably assumed I kept the gate locked when I was there. It wouldn't have been that big of a deal at all, but I was young and felt like I might be made fun of by him, if nothing else, as they were all manly men, and I liked books. So I opened the gate back up real quick, ran over and kicked the snow around so it hid the angel, locked it up, and went back to my car. I wasn't exactly fully terrified at this point, even though it was certainly unsettling. I just thought it was really weird and could have been an illegal hunter, even though hunting in the night in the cold didn't make much sense. Regardless, the imprint was made 2 hours earlier, and I assumed that they were gone. But that's when I heard it. When I was getting into my SUV, there was the loudest high-pitched laugh coming from the woods. It almost sounded like a fake laugh, like how the witch in The Wizard of Oz would laugh or something. Like someone was doing it on purpose to show they weren't scared of me, or how I'd react all at once. I knew they were laughing at me on our property. It was close enough that I knew that they could probably see me, but I couldn't see them, since, other than the street light, there was no illumination. After a few seconds of laughter they stopped, and then it was just silence everywhere, except for my heart beating through my ears. Then the laughing started again, louder this time, more like screaming and laughing combined. I sort of froze for 5 seconds, listening in a panic. Now I've spent a lot of time in that area, and I knew what coyotes and foxes sound like at night with their high-pitched screeches during mating season, so I can't completely logistically rule that out. But to me, it honestly sounded like an adult man trying to emulate a woman laughing, like someone who was deliberately trying to make a fake, scary shriek laugh in order to scare someone. And it worked. After those 5 seconds, I was filled with adrenaline, got into my car, and drove the hell away from there as fast as I could without sliding off the road. Back at home, I was up all night trying to figure it out, and told my parents the story when they awoke. After talking it out, we decided it was one of two things. It was either my brain somehow convincing myself that the snow formation was angel-shaped, when it was really just caused by an animal, and then the snow tracks and laughing were just a coyote or red fox, though I don't think that's what it was. What I truly believe is the second thing, which is that some local was out walking around for some reason and decided to mess with me. I didn't have any close friends left in the area that would do this, and if they did, they certainly would have brought it up to make fun of me for speeding away in terror. I found out later the nearest house was a super old couple, so I highly doubt that it was any of them, which means whomever it was went out into the woods in the night in the freezing cold just to mess with a stranger. I don't have any mental issues, family history of them, don't do drugs, but I do drink socially, but I didn't that night. I also don't believe in the paranormal, so I never once gave it a thought. I know in my heart, someone was out there. I worked there another 6 weeks or so and never had a single issue, though I know where my boss kept his gun, and I always made sure it was there when I started my shift, and I certainly always locked the gate from then on. Thinking about this experience that night, the part that freaked me out the most was that he'd have had to have waited around for me to leave for about 2 hours just to do that laugh. He didn't know me. I could have been crazy and the type of person to get mad and try and find him and attack him, yet he didn't seem scared or care while he tried to mess with me. For some random dude, this is probably a story he tells from his point of view to somehow make his friends giggle in hysteria. But for me, that dude, and the one I call Angel in the Snow guy, the one with the laugh I'll never forget, let's not meet.
I grew up in the mountains, on a dirt road, in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was 8 miles away. My little sister and I, we were around 11 and 8, were latchkey kids, and every night we'd walk home from the bus stop and hang out at home until our parents got out of work. One night the phone rang. I ran to answer it, and I hear lots of static, and I can't really hear anyone speaking. This is when the first cell phones came out, and we didn't actually know anyone who had one. My sister and I were also taught that if someone asked to speak to one of our parents, not to tell the caller they weren't home, just that they couldn't come to the phone. The phone rings. I answer again, and this time I can hear a very low and creepy man's voice. The man said, "Where's your mummy?" Me, I said, "She can't come to the phone right now." The man with an evil, creepy laugh, "Come on, where's your mummy?" I freak out and hang up. The phone rings again. With my hand shaking, I answer. There's lots of static again, and I can hear a car engine. The voice said, "I'm coming to get you. Where's your mummy? She's not home." I hang up the phone and take my sister into our bedroom, and we hide on the floor between our beds. I'm crying and shaking and this is making her cry. Our only neighbour was not home, so any adult intervention was at least 15 minutes away. I pick up the phone to call my mother, and the man is on the line again. It was like I picked it up just before it rang. This voice said, "I see you, where's your mummy?" I was able to get through to my mother finally, and she called my grandfather, who went to the house and took us to his house. Nothing ever happened, and I still don't know who the caller was. My sister and I stayed with our grandparents after school for several days after that. To the creepy caller, let's not meet ever.
In my late teens, I had this friend called Felix. Unlike my social anxiety-ridden self, he was a social butterfly and appeared to know everyone. As such, I ended up knowing a lot of people by proxy and hung out with some interesting folk. The one I'm going to be talking about is called Carly. I was at Felix's place one night with a few people, and we were all playing a game of Risk. We'd smoked a bit and got to talking about some weird topics, compounded by the fact that we were all strange teens. You know, the usual. My buddy had crazy stories about getting struck at a radio tower. Another friend had stories about getting locked in a basement all night. I had my ghost stories, and it was one of the few times people believed me, so that was nice. Carly had the one we called bullshit on the most. She was your typical edgy goth girl, complete with clothes that would put a stripper to shame and enough makeup that it had noticeable thickness. She was hot, I admit that, but we were distant friends, and I'd only hung out with her a few times with Felix. She seemed nice though, if a bit emotionally reserved. Well, this night, she up and states that she's an energy vampire. I had no idea what that was, and as I didn't really have access to a lot of internet in rural Newfoundland, she goes on to say that she gets energy from people's emotions, she can feel people's auras, and she detects when people have issues, and she has to keep her emotions in check because she can get powerful. Me and Felix obviously call bull, as we had never seen her be powerful, and those claims reek of fake, coming from some edgy goth kid. She goes on and does a reading, where she's able to tell me about my emotions. I remember she rightly said I was depressed, but that isn't much of a shocker to anyone who'd met me, and told Felix he had a grave impending injury. His mum did have a stroke about a year later, for what little that might be worth, but she also said some other vague things to the rest of the people we were hanging out with, which were probably correct, but I don't know. Finally, after this had gone on for an hour or so, I called her bluff. I asked her where she got her mystical powers. I remember asking if her dad was a warlock and her mum a pixie. She says she was taught by Mother Hilda. That was the most bull name I've ever heard, I said. Where the hell does she live? Up your ass. Becoming visibly distressed, she said to me and Felix, who were laughing, that she could bring me to meet her next weekend. Thinking she would bring me to one of her weird goth friends who would try to do some edgy stuff, I was always down for a laugh and said yes. Felix was down as well, so it was settled. Now it's important to know that I have an issue with being a passenger in cars. I fall asleep almost immediately while not driving. If I'm lucky, I can make it 5 minutes, and that's a miracle. It's really important to remember this, because I sure as hell wish it wasn't the case. So when the weekend comes, me and Felix and Carly all get together to go meet this person. I had assumed it would be some person that we would meet in the basement of her parents' house, but Carly says that Mother Hilda lives on the Bonavista Peninsula, That's a good 3 hours drive away in good weather from where we are. So I was frankly more angry that she didn't bring snacks. So we all got in the car. She had gotten her license already since she was 6 months older than us, and we set off. In my true fashion, I fell asleep within minutes, and I don't think we even hit the highway before I was out. When I had woken up, we were driving on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. For those of you who haven't been to Newfoundland, I think my wife put the Bonavista Peninsula best. It's like you're walking on the graves of a million really pissed off ghosts. Gloomy skies, gloomy landscapes, and a real feeling that someone is watching you from the tree line where you can't see them. I frankly hate that place. Most people I know from it are great, but everyone who I know who lives on it is miserable. So I come to, and we're driving down this poor excuse for a road, and what could be more aptly named a goat path. So I immediately start complaining. Where the hell are we? Why are we here? What are you planning? You know, reasonable questions. To all these questions, she just answered, Mother Hilda will answer. In the tone of a psychopath. Felix doesn't say a word and just looks mildly amused. So after what felt like forever, we come to a clearing. It is really just a place where the trees aren't that big. In the middle sat an old-school Newfoundland box house in absolutely horrible condition. Like no one had shown this house a lick of love in over 100 years kind of rundown. It still had windows, but the roof looked like it was attempting to threaten the ground with its lean. I remember the place was blue, and the goat path didn't reach all the way up to it. It stopped 100 feet shy. Carly stopped the car, gets out, and like a psycho says again, Mother Hilda will answer. I look to Felix, who has the biggest grin on his face. He's high as a kite. I berate him, as this is horrifying, and his only real response getting out of the car is, You're a better man for me than doing this sober. So I get out of the car with Felix, who insists that I go first. My only thought is that I am going to meet the end. Carly walks through the trees with her arms outstretched in a T-pose, spinning and singing, Mother Hilda knows all. Felix looks at me and says, We're getting ended, aren't we? Carly reaches the door, opens it up, and motions for us to come in. Now I saw two options. Either go in with the witchy woman or brave the untamed wilderness of rural Newfoundland in who knows where. I decide the latter, as that one only has a chance that I don't perish and no one finds the body. I reach the door, and the place is pitch black inside. It was a generally overcast day outside, and the windows must have been covered in paper or something. Not freaking furnished. No lighting, just rotting boards and the smell of my impending doom. I can hear Carly laughing upstairs, because of course there's an upstairs. So I think, yep, this is where I meet my maker. This is a house where she does her weird rituals, and I can tell Felix is thinking the same thing, but he insists I go first. Thankfully, the stairs were next to the door in the front of the house, so I didn't have to risk walking through that creepy place. When I look up the stairs, I nearly wet myself. At the top is a girl, naked, and pointing down the upstairs hallway. She has makeup like Carly, thick and dark, and is staring at us with intent, evil eyes. I turn to look at Felix when the girl at the top of the stairs belts out, in a voice louder than I'd peg her to have, Mother Hilda doesn't wait. I was so petrified. I walk up those stairs and the place was eerie silent. I hadn't really noticed it before, but there was no sound of the wind in the trees, no birds chirping, no rustling, and no floorboards creaking. I started to get those really nasty vibes. Felix flashed me a hunting knife he brought along with him and whispered, "I got you. We're leaving alive." Feeling 0.1% better, I reached the top of the stairs. The girl, who was maybe 14, ran into a room on the upper floor, and I saw Carly at the end of the hall next to a door, what I assumed to be a closet. She had the biggest grin on her face, like a proud child about to show their mum a Play-Doh figure they had worked on all day. I walked closer, and with all the manly gusto I had in me, made it 5 steps in the hallway. I had the feeling that I was going to puke, and every fibre in my being was telling me whatever was behind that door was danger, pure danger. Carly looked at me and said, "Mother Hilda will see you now," and opened the door. What was inside was what I believed to be a small child. Its back turned to me and was eating something in the closet. I remember seeing chicken bones at its feet, which were huge. It was wearing a ratty red shawl and was arse naked below the waist. And that's when I noticed it was an old person. It had that typical saggy old person arse, the one that lacks all tone and definition. I was watching this thing turn around, and it was the scariest sight of my life. It was some kind of old woman, but I questioned that frequently given its appearance. It had tiny, tiny arms, like an infant on a toddler's body, that was holding her shawl up. It had wispy angelic strands barely holding onto its head, and a noticeable hump on its back. I assumed I noticed this because its face didn't make sense. It was teeth, just one big mouth with hundreds of misshapen teeth. The entire face looked like it had been scooped out and just given teeth, rows upon rows. I saw no eyes, no nose, no forehead, just long, creepy teeth. It snarled and yelled, "No men!" I passed out. When I woke up, I was back in Felix's house, him already up and staring at the floor with a 1,000-yard stare. I asked him if I had some kind of weird dream, and without missing a beat he says, "Mother Hilda is real, man." I thought it was a creepy fake thing, but I saw it too. We spoke for about 30 minutes about what happened, and we'd basically had the same recollection of events, except Felix saw her move a step or two closer before he blacked out. I said I should go home. He said I should leave, and we both went our separate ways. Over the next few days, I'd tried to message Carly back in the days of MSN, but the only response I ever got was, "Mother Hilda never forgets." After 3 days of this, about 10 messages a day, I say to Carly, I don't need that in my life, and I never hung out with her again. Although I did see her from time to time in school, but she refused to look at me. I had only one more encounter with Mother Hilda, or whatever the hell she is. I had quite a big yard before the river, and had a sizable fire pit where I would have fires. Having Felix as my only real friend, I had many bonfires alone. That was fine. I enjoyed the spectacle of it all. So one night I was having a fire, and started to get really into it. Flames were perhaps 15 feet high, and I was having a great time. I'd whipped off my shirt, placed it by the 6-foot poking stick, and had begun chanting in gibberish. I don't know why, but it was a conscious action. Teenagers are weird. On the other side of the fire, through a line of trees, was a smaller path my neighbour had to go to the woods. I catch a glance out of the corner of my eye. There's something small in the trees. Thinking it could be a wildcat or perhaps a baby bear, I stopped to look at it. From the other side of the line, I see Mother Hilda, her gaping maw wide open and facing my direction. I go to scream, as is a logical action, but Mother Hilda yells, "No!" and my raging inferno goes out. Not even an ember stayed lit. Cold, dead fire. I looked back. No Mother Hilda. I decided that was enough of that. I booked it to my house as fast as my legs could carry. When I get inside, my mum asks me why I'm not having the fire anymore. She rarely cared what I did, so I asked why she wanted to know. My mum said that the nice girl who wears black asked me about it maybe 5 minutes ago at the front door. Mum had told her I was having a fire, and she started to walk to the backyard. I go to my room, horrified, and message Carly on MSN to demand what the hell. I shouldn't have gotten an answer, since she had just been at my door, but I did. Mother Hilda likes you. I haven't really told anyone this story before now, as it's one of the more outlandish ones, but my friend Felix still won't talk about it. I met him a while ago when I travelled back to Newfoundland, and asked him if he remembered Carly in the creepy house. He just looked at me and said with dead eyes, "Mother Hilda is real, man. Don't mess about," and walked away. I still have yet to make sense of it, like a lot of things that have happened to me.
Well, there was an incident which taught me to regularly make what is called a J-turn, to watch and check my back trail. I was scouting a distant group of hills along an inaccessible river with no docks for miles. There were past rumours of mountain lions being back in there, though all the eastern breeds are supposedly not in existence anymore. There had been a light snow before dawn, but it didn't hinder me from walking way back and cresting the highest hilltop where I could see the big bend of the river. For whatever reason, I decided to circle the tippy top of this hill before going back down, where I could then pick up my old trail, where I walked inwards. When I completed my circling, I came back down, but immediately stopped dead. There were a second set of prints right next to my steps. Big paw prints. As I sat watching that river, there was a huge big cat sitting somewhere watching me. Now heading back down, I had lost the high ground, and the pursuit position was now in his favour. I made J-turns every 300 yards on the way back. I make J-turns on the way in and out of every area I hunt if it is in a remote location. And yes, I've seen dogs, deer, and even men following my paths before.
This happened earlier this summer. I was on vacation with my cousin. We were both 16, as well as my uncle, in upstate New York, pretty much Canada. We had a pretty nice house, along with a small cabin on the same property that my cousin and I were staying in by a lake, that was really nice and in the middle of nowhere. It was about 40 minutes to the nearest gas station. On our part/section of the lake, there were 2 other houses, one about half a mile away from us and the other even further than that. Our house is right up on the lake, but with a small section of the forest that we have to walk through. About 5 feet of trees from the yard to the water to get to the dock. The trees are right up against the water with no beach. My cousin and I decide to go sit on the dock at around midnight. We're sitting on the dock for 20 minutes when we heard loud crunching footsteps in the trees about 5 yards to the left of the dock in the trees, right on the shoreline. It could only have been a bear, deer, or human, judging from the sound. My uncle had a chihuahua, so that was out of the question. We wanted to sprint inside, but didn't in case it was a bear or moose that would chase us. So we stayed out on the dock to try and see what it was. The footsteps stopped for a bit. As we were trying to look past the trees, a flashlight shined out from the trees and onto us. We booked it inside, where we saw my uncle and dog sitting on the couch. We searched the whole property and couldn't find anyone or anything, and I still have no idea who it was.
My buddy and I decided to do a Halloween ride up a supposedly haunted trail at night. As we were making our way back to the main road, I see a car parked to the right side of the trail with the lights on. I thought it was kind of weird that I would see a sedan parked in a dirt road so far out in the middle of nowhere. We pull ahead of the car and stop our bikes. When we look back, there was nothing, no car, just darkness. I could see how wide my friend's eyes were from the inside of his helmet. I asked him if he saw a car parked to the side. He said yes. Then I got the most uncomfortable, chilly feeling and my eyes began to water. I felt like I was going to cry and I felt every goosebump on my skin. I remember the sound or the lack of it. No animals, no insects. I just heard the ringing in my ear. My friend told me that we had to leave, but I couldn't move. I think I was in shock or something. He told me again, and this time I heard the fear in his voice. He sounded like a little kid. We both hopped on our bikes and rode as quickly as we could back onto the main road.
This story is from my cousin Steve. Steve is an outdoorsy person. He likes to camp and hike and stuff. He never gave me specifics on where he was with this story, so it could be anywhere in a forested area in the wilderness. He said it was late in September/early October, something like that, and this was in 2004. He set up a little campsite in a small clearing no bigger than a large living room. The first night, everything was fine. No troubles at all. But that afternoon, quite a while after he'd woken back up, he felt oddly drawn to somewhere off in the distance in the forest. He said he was like on autopilot and wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. Steve said he wasn't too far away from the campsite into the trees when he noticed what looked like a toppled over grave. That's how he described it, at least. A rectangular slab of stone. But he said it was weirdly out of place and definitely didn't belong there. It looked polished, sort of glossy and reflective. There was no writing or scrawling on it. It was smooth and plain, but despite it sitting on a pile of dead leaves, there was no forest debris on it, no twigs fallen, or even moss on it. It was very unusual, especially considering, to his knowledge, there was nobody around for miles, but it looked like it had been placed there very recently. At the moment, Steve said that he felt as though he had been picked up and dropped randomly somewhere on Earth, and had zero clue where he was. He said, even though he could clearly make out the red canvas or nylon or whatever his tent may be 25 feet or so behind him, he said he was just utterly confused and totally unfamiliar with his surroundings. Then he said that two things happened very quickly. First, he felt an ice-cold wave of air hit him, like a cold wind on a frigid winter day, despite it being relatively warm for early autumn, and there was no wind present. The branches on the trees hadn't moved, and the leaves on the ground didn't budge at all. Second, he heard what sounded like a loud, deafening clap, like someone clapped their hands just once, really hard, and it echoed across the valley. Next thing he knew, the sun is already dipping below the horizon, and it's pretty dark in the woods. Only a split second earlier, it had been 3:30 in the afternoon. Now it was closer to 8 at night, in the blink of an eye. Steve said he did not see the stone on the ground anywhere, and he booked it to his tent, scared out of his mind. According to him, it wouldn't be a good idea to pack everything up right now at dusk and try to make his way back during the night, so he'd have to wait until the morning to do so. He said he barely slept the entire night. All the while he heard a seriously creepy sound not too far from the tent. He said it sounded like someone snoring, and it might have simply been a sleeping animal, like a bear or mountain lion. Not too sure if they snore, but they probably do. He waited a little bit until after dawn, and he packed up his stuff and got out of there, with the feeling that he was being watched the entire time he was in the woods.
I used to walk around the farm property that I live on during the early hours of the morning because my sleep schedule was gone. And I hate coyotes. I've never had an issue. It was a bit spooky, but I typically got through it. Except one time, at about 1 AM-ish, I was halfway through my walk when I saw something that appeared to be 9 foot tall, walking towards the crossroads I was heading to. So I turned my arse around, ran half a mile back to my house, waited outside a bit to see if anything was there, and while waiting suddenly the fear went away and I went back inside. My boot size is 11 wide. There's almost nothing that has a print that size, aside from a mountain lion or bear, which my area doesn't have. The claws are nearly as long as the pad. It doesn't make sense. So yeah, without my posse of dogs, I don't walk around at night anymore.
This didn't happen to me, but my grandpa. My family owns a chunk of land about an hour outside of Yellowstone National Park. It's very beautiful but very remote. We go up there every summer for a few weeks, but my grandpa lives there for the whole summer. So he does most of the upkeep around the property, maintaining fences, oiling the cabin, and clearing out dead trees. So decades ago, way before I was born, my grandpa was out on the property, replacing parts of the fence. He did the work alone, but always brought his German Shepherd Scout along with him for company. So my grandpa is finishing up his work, and it's approaching dusk, when he hears Scout whining. He looks up. The dog is alert and just staring into the woods. He didn't think too much of it, and guessed he probably just smelled a grouse or some other small animal. So my grandpa finishes packing up his tools and is ready to head out to the cabin. He calls Scout, but he won't move. He's staring into the woods. My grandpa literally has to grab Scout by the scruff and turn him around before they start heading down the trail. You have to understand that Scout was a good dog and always listened to my grandpa, so ignoring commands was very abnormal. So they're walking down the trail. It's only about a 10-minute walk to the cabin, but it's through some of the thickest forest on the property, and it's getting dark fast. The whole time my grandpa said he felt a growing sense of unease, like he was being followed. Scout would stop every few steps and turn around and growl, staring into the trees. My grandpa would stop sometimes to look out, but never saw anything. This continued the whole way home. They finally reached the clearing where the cabin was built, and obviously my grandpa is relieved. He gets to the front door, and Scout is next to him, barking like mad at the trail they just left. So my grandpa looks over one more time, and he finally sees it. On the edge of the clearing, staring right back at him, is a mountain lion. Scout is long gone, but my grandpa swears that dog saved his life. Mountain lions like to ambush their prey, but Scout likely prevented that from happening.
So, I used to live with my ex and his family. Across the street from his neighbourhood was an amazing swathe of woods, a very wide creek, and if you were enough of an explorer to figure out how to cross this creek, you'd hit another swathe of woods, and then the Potomac River. It was gorgeous. Anyways, I was always sitting out in my car late, and started hearing these horrific sounds, like animal screams. I've always loved the woods and loved tromping through areas that are off the path. Around animal scream time, I started finding animal bodies. Deer, beaver, raccoon. They were killed, but unnaturally so. Their limbs were bent at completely unnatural angles. At times, I found their bodies dissected, all the pieces near each other, but broken apart in distinct sections. Clear cuts. Nothing you'd see in nature. Some were really brutal. Once I came across a deer, legs wrenched backwards and the rib cage bent completely open. There have been reports of coyotes in this region, but the thing is, none of them appear to have been consumed at all. It was just like they were bent into all the wrong directions and killed. I think it was these animals' screams that I heard. Some of them were skinned, but what was weird was that the skin wasn't collected. Someone had neatly skinned them and just left the results of the skinning in a pile by the bodies, like they did it just because. The skin had fur in such pristine condition that it could have easily been sold. Why skin the creature if you're not going to do anything with it? I eventually told my dad about it over a phone call. He freaked out and told me not to go out alone anymore. At the time, my intrigue masked my logic, but I'm now able to recognise I was most likely witnessing the work of a sadist. Also, like every other person out there, I was a psych major, and these are the hallmarks of future killers. We'll see, but it was messed up and definitely was the work of a human.
I was with a group of 7 to 8 guys who rented a cabin for the weekend for a bachelor party. The same group of guys get a cabin once a year for a bro weekend. We had hoped to get the same spot we normally book, but it was unavailable. So the best man ended up booking a place that we'd never been to before, in a very remote part of the state. The place itself was cool, built in 1780 or 1790 on a big creek, and very remote. Now I'm a skeptic, but the guy who was getting married is not, and has had several experiences that has made him a believer. As soon as we walk in, the groom-to-be, Tom, says, "This place is haunted. I can feel it." I don't buy it, thinking that he's just saying it because the place was old. It was fascinating to think about the history there, though. It was in the middle of nowhere now. The people who lived there 200 years ago would have been completely removed from civilization. The first night, we all stayed up late partying into the morning. Tom, who was an offensive lineman in college, wakes me up by jumping on my bed and squashing me. We were supposed to go out that night to a nearby college town, but just ended up staying there. I was a little bored doing the same thing 2 nights in a row, and still tired from raging last night, so I ended up going to bed before anyone else at around midnight. I've of course heard about sleep paralysis, but never experienced it before, so I was terrified when I woke up for seemingly no reason and couldn't move at all. Almost immediately, I see a shadow in the doorway. I think that it's Tom and the best man, who are trying to wake me up so I can rejoin the party. The shadow starts to move towards me. I think it's Tom, and that he's going to jump on the bed to squash me again. I try to yell out for him not to do that, but there's something wrong. I can't move, and I can't make a sound. Suddenly I realize that it's not Tom approaching my bed, but what I can only describe as a black shadowy mass. It did not have a human shape, but was about the same height and width as a human. It's moving fast, and when it gets to the edge of my bed, it jumps like it's going to land on me and squash me, like I was worried that my friend was gonna do. When it gets over to me, it dissipates, spreads out, and vanishes in an instant. I can move again. I sit up and wonder what the hell just happened. I call out to my friends and there is silence. I look out the window and see that they are all outside there, still partying around the campfire. I get up, drink some water, and peek at my phone. It's 2 a.m. I look in the others' rooms, and they are indeed outside. It was maybe 10 seconds from the time I woke up, unable to move, to the time when the shadow or black mass disappeared. I was a little shaken up, felt some adrenaline for sure, but wrote it off as a bad dream, and fell back asleep after 15 minutes or so. But when I awoke again, I immediately began to think about it, how weird it felt being unable to move, and what I saw. Months later, it's still on my mind, and that's why I decided to share this. My story freaked some of the bros out, but everyone loved this cabin so much more than the one we usually stayed at, that we're very likely to be going back there this fall. So perhaps I'll have more to share then, but I don't think I'd like to stay in that same room though. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to give a huge thank you to the Crime Reel for joining me in today's video and narrating some of these stories. If you enjoyed tonight's video, please don't forget that I am narrating a super chilling case over on his channel. I highly recommend it, and the link will be on screen shortly or in the description if you're just itching to get there. I also would like to give a huge thank you, as always, to my amazing patrons who seriously help me keep the channel running. You guys are all amazing. If you are interested in having your name featured on the credits of every video, as well as a plethora of perks, feel free to also check out my Patreon page, where you can find out more information. But anyway, the link is now on screen. I hope to see you there.